I'm Tanya. I'm an OpenSciEd teacher and facilitator. Today we're going to chat about Lesson 10 in the McKenna unit, where we now start to dig into a different question we had about McKenna, which is why and how is she actually losing so much weight? Let's take a minute and remember how we got here. In the last lesson, we just spent the day really digging into identifying the questions we can now answer and the questions on our driving question board that we couldn't. We then decided to revisit McKenna's doctor's note and see that most of the questions we could answer involved her digestive system, but the questions we couldn't answer were usually about other systems of the body. This leads us to wonder how one system may be connected to another, and we decide to dig into one of our questions, which is why is McKenna losing so much weight? Many students have an idea of why, but we still don't have the evidence we need to confirm how and why it's happening. Let's take a minute and look at the lesson at a glance. This is a 2-day investigation lesson. There will be about 60 minutes of material preparation required for the student's hand-on investigation. There are several videos you'll want to review in advance of this lesson, which includes the investigation setup and some supplemental videos. You may wish to have students use their devices at one point, but it's not necessary depending on how you structure your lesson. Let's take a peek at the lesson at a glance. In this 2-day lesson, it can be broken down into 2 major sense-making chunks for students. The first happens on day 1, where students navigate into the lesson and elevate that one symptom that might be the easiest to explain is why McKenna's losing so much weight. We then revisit her doctor's note and identify patterns and data about her weight and her height over the years. We see that McKenna's height and weight were within the average range up until about the age of 11 or 12 when she started to feel sick. At this point, we see that it drops quickly, and she has been dropping ever since. This then leads us to a reading about where fat goes when it's lost. In the article, we read that fat is burned, but we're wondering how this applies to our bodies. So we are wondering, what does it really mean when we say we burn fat, and is that actually possible? This brings us to the second section, where we decide we want to investigate this idea of burning fat. We decide to use several types of fat, including duck fat and vegetable oil, to collect our data. We start by watching a wick burn demonstration by itself to see what happens to only the wick. We then burn the wick in both fats to see that as they burn, the fat appears to decrease and some of its properties are changing. This leads us to think, based off of prior units, that a chemical reaction might be happening. But we end this lesson by realizing we need some more accurate data to really understand if it's a chemical reaction that's happening or not. By the end of Lesson 10, we have figured out that McKenna has been growing at a similar rate to healthy kids, but then around 11 or 12, she stopped growing. From our reading, we learned that when people lose weight, they're actually losing fat, so we decided to conduct an investigation to help figure this out. From this, we've learned that when you burn fat, the mass decreases, and some properties change, and therefore we're thinking a chemical reaction is actually happening. Now let's take a look at some of the key moments in this lesson. The first key moment happens in part 4 of day 1, when the students are working through the reading about the idea of burning fat. Here, the students should elevate that this is a phrase or term that they've often heard or used themselves, but they don't really know exactly what it means or what's happening. Many students will now start to question whether there are actually little fires happening in their bodies, and this is a question that will help connect to the next part of the lesson. Then on day 2, our second key moment happens in part 8. Here, students are actually able to see the mass of the fat is actually decreasing as it burns, and some of the properties are changing. This is similar to what's happening with McKenna and the fact that she's losing her weight. This, from their prior knowledge from past units, should help to solidify their idea that this might actually be a chemical reaction, but it also leaves them with some more questions and ideas for more data to collect to confirm it. By the end of Lesson 10, we are pretty confident that when you burn fat, you are seeing a chemical reaction. But as we complete our making sense questions, we realize we may have a few more questions or some more data that we want to collect to be sure, and this is what's going to lead us into Lesson 11. Now let's take a peek at some materials management and tips and tricks for this lesson. At the start of the lesson, when the students are working with the data, make sure to give enough time for students to unpack the data and see how quickly McKenna actually lost weight. This moment has stood out to my students in the past because they were surprised at how quickly something like this could happen and change. And as I said before, during the reading, it will help if you elevate student questions around this concept of burning fat, since this will directly lead to the investigation that you'll be doing in the second part of the lesson. For the investigation itself, if your school doesn't allow students to handle flames, or if your building has a no flame policy, there are reference videos available for the entire investigation, or you could conduct the investigation as a whole class demonstration. There's guidance within the teacher edition around these. And finally, during the lesson, your students are collecting evidence that leads them to thinking there's a chemical reaction occurring, and some of them might even be quite sure. But if you start to confirm this at this point, you might be throwing off where you're going in lesson 11, which is where we're going to dig deeper into the chemical reaction that is happening to actually confirm it. So at this point, it's important to elevate that it's a really good prediction based off of the two pieces of evidence that we've seen. However, we do need some more concrete evidence to confirm that it's true. If you've completed Units 7.1 or 7.2, you may wish to remind your students at this point about reactants or products, the law of conservation of mass, open and closed systems, things along this line to make them question whether they have enough evidence to actually prove it's a chemical reaction. In this lesson, there are no new word wall words that are earned. However, you will encounter the word median that has been brought up in the past. In addition, you won't be creating or necessarily using any posters, but you still may wish to have your driving question board or your models available to reference if it's applicable as you're moving through the lesson. I've always found Lesson 10 to be fun for my students, whether they do the labs themselves or we do it together as a class demonstration. I also really like how this lesson sets the stage for Lesson 11, where we're going to be digging deeper and explaining the chemical reaction that's actually happening, which is much more complex for students.